The sun was just starting to set when an ordinary day turned into something unforgettable. A man minding his own business found himself face to face with a group of officers demanding his ID for no apparent reason. Calm but firm, he knew his rights and refused, sparking a tense back and forth that quickly spiraled out of control. As the cameras rolled, their approach became more aggressive, exposing a startling misunderstanding of the law. What started as a routine encounter turned into a shocking display of overreach, leaving the officers scrambling to cover their tracks. But it was too late. Their huge mistake was caught on camera for everyone to see. How far would they push? And would the man stand his ground or give in? Stay tuned to see the full story unfold and discover why this standoff will leave you questioning everything about your rights and accountability. The man had been walking down a quiet street when he noticed the police car pull up beside him. At first, it seemed like nothing, just another routine stop. But as the officers got out and approached, something felt off. They didn't give him a reason for stopping him, didn't explain why they needed his ID. When he politely asked, the mood shifted instantly. The officers, clearly frustrated, insisted it was a legal requirement to show identification, even though he hadn't committed any crime. His heart raced, but he stayed calm. He'd heard enough stories about these kinds of situations to know his rights, and he wasn't about to let this turn into something bigger than it needed to be. But the officers weren't backing down. They became more insistent, their voices rising, demanding compliance in a way that made it clear they weren't used to being challenged. Where would this go next? The tension in the air was thick as the officers' frustration mounted. One of them stepped closer, his tone now dripping with authority, while the other circled behind him. "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be," he warned. But the man stood his ground, refusing to hand over any ID without understanding why. This wasn't about being difficult. It was about standing up for what was right. He felt a surge of defiance. As the seconds ticked by, it became clear the officers weren't prepared for this kind of pushback. They'd expected compliance, and when it didn't come, their tactics became more forceful. The man could sense the growing frustration, the officers' desperation to regain control of the situation. One officer pulled out a notebook, scribbling something down. Was he taking notes or trying to intimidate him? Meanwhile, the street was quiet. No one around seemed to notice what was happening, but the few who did were watching. The standoff seemed surreal. Would they escalate? Was this really happening? As the man remained calm, the officers' voices grew louder, filled with a mix of confusion and rising anger. What was it about this man that was making them so desperate to get him to break? The silence on the street was suffocating now, broken only by the sharp exchange of words between the man and the officers. One of the officers moved in closer, his hand twitching near his belt, but not quite reaching for his radio or any equipment. The man's mind raced. Was this where things escalated? Would they try to arrest him for something he hadn't done? He couldn't afford to make a wrong move. The pressure was mounting as the seconds stretched into what felt like eternity. Every word he said seemed to fuel the officer's anger even more. "You're obstructing justice," one of them snapped, the accusation laced with a thinly veiled threat. But the man refused to back down. He knew the law. He knew they couldn't just demand his ID without cause. Yet the officers seemed to grow more unhinged by his refusal, their faces flushed with embarrassment and authority. The situation felt fragile, like a single wrong word or gesture could send everything spiraling. The officer who had been scribbling in his notebook stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing. The man's stomach turned. Was he writing something down to use against him later? Was this just the beginning of something much bigger? He couldn't help but feel like he was being watched by more than just these two officers. Could this be a bigger setup, or was it just a matter of power gone wrong? Tension filled every inch of the air. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the pavement, adding to the creeping unease. Then, as the officer closest to him reached for something in his jacket, the man held his breath, waiting for the next move. The balance was tipping, and nothing would be the same after this moment. Just as the officer's hand moved to his jacket, the unexpected happened. Another car screeched to a halt a few feet away. The man's heart skipped. What now? The new arrival, a third officer, stepped out, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his stride was unmistakable. Without a word, he walked straight past the two officers, ignoring them completely. The first officer shot him a confused glance, but the new arrival didn't even acknowledge it. Instead, he turned to the man. "You're free to go," he said, his voice calm but firm. The words felt like an anchor, but they left the man more confused than relieved. What was happening? Was this a setup, or had the officers simply made a mistake? The original two officers exchanged looks, their earlier anger now replaced with uncertainty. "What do you mean, he's free to go?" One of them asked, his voice sharp, but now betraying a hint of doubt. The newcomer didn't flinch. "You're out of your jurisdiction," he said flatly. "You have no reason to be questioning him." The statement hit like a hammer, but the situation didn't seem to ease. Instead, it only added more layers of mystery. The first two officers shifted uncomfortably, the power dynamic shifting in a way they weren't prepared for. The man, still standing his ground, took a slow step back, his eyes darting between the three men. Who was this third officer? Why hadn't he said anything sooner? And why had they let things go this far before stepping in? His mind raced as the stakes of this encounter went higher. Would this new officer be his ally, or was something else at play here? Something much bigger than just a street stop. The air hung thick with tension as the two officers glanced at each other, visibly shaken by the new arrival's words. The third officer, standing firm, continued to stare them down, his presence commanding. The man stood there, still uncertain, wondering if this was really happening. Was he really about to walk away, free from the situation that had escalated so quickly? The original officers seemed to be weighing their next move, caught between what was right and what they had been trying to prove. Just as the first officer took a step forward, clearly intent on challenging the newcomer's authority, something unexpected happened. The third officer pulled out a small device and flicked it on, showing the original two officers a video, his body camera footage. The footage was of their interactions with the man, but what was on the screen left them speechless. They had been recorded not just misusing their authority, but outright violating protocols. The footage was clear, showing that they had no legitimate cause to question him in the first place. It was a damning piece of evidence. The man felt his heart race as he realized the tables had completely turned. The two officers were now trapped by their own actions. But before any of them could speak, the third officer addressed the man. "Don't worry, you're not in trouble," he said, his voice softening. But it's clear these officers overstepped. Just as he thought he was about to be let go, the third officer added one final bombshell. "And by the way," he said, looking at the original officers, "you're both under investigation for abuse of power." The words hit like a punch, leaving everyone frozen in place. The man couldn't believe what he was hearing. This had just gone from a simple stop to something much bigger. The officers were caught in a lie, and now they were the ones facing the consequences. As the third officer turned to walk away, he gave the man a brief nod. "Stay safe," he said, disappearing down the street without another word. The man stood there, trying to process everything. What had started as a simple interaction had spiraled into something that could change everything. The mystery of the third officer's timely intervention and the quiet power shift was enough to leave him wondering. How often does this kind of thing happen? And who else might be out there watching, waiting to expose the truth? As the man stood there, the weight of everything slowly sank in. The officers who had once towered over him in authority were now left speechless, their plans unraveling before them. The third officer's swift action had turned the situation around completely, but the man couldn't help but wonder how many others were out there who didn't get so lucky. He looked down at his phone, realizing he had captured the entire encounter on video. This wasn't just about his rights anymore. It was about holding those in power accountable. He walked away from the scene, his thoughts racing. The street now seemed quieter, almost surreal, as if the moment itself was still unfolding in the back of his mind. He didn't know where this would lead, but one thing was certain. Things had changed. For him, for the officers, and maybe for anyone who ever questioned authority. The system wasn't perfect, but today, it had worked.